Okay, let's unpack this. We are launching into a deep dive today on, well, the economic shockwave that generative AI is creating. And it's different this time. For, gosh, a century, the fear around automation was always about blue-collar jobs, right? Factory floors, farms, those repetitive physical tasks. But this current revolution, it's targeting white-collar work directly, high-skilled cognitive jobs, kind of jobs that form the bedrock of the modern middle class, the roles many of you listening probably spent years at university training for, thinking, okay, this one's safe. So our mission here is pretty clear. We're synthesizing some powerful, sometimes frankly alarming findings from key sources. We're looking at the AI Index report, PwC's jobs barometer, and some really critical academic work on how automation is changing labor theory itself. We really need to get our heads around why Gen AI feels different, why it's shifting the whole economic equation from tech being complementary, helping us work faster, to being substitutive, doing the job instead of us. And naturally, that leads us straight into some pretty radical policy ideas being debated.
The big one, of course, is universal basic income. But it's being reframed, isn't it? Not just as welfare, but maybe as essential collective risk sharing. So the core question we want you, the listener, to chew on today is this. If high productivity now means sacrificing high-skilled jobs, are we looking at a fundamental social reboot just to keep the wheels on the economy? But before we get to policy, we absolutely have to grasp the scale and, honestly, the terrifying speed of the technology itself.
That speed is absolutely central to why this feels so unprecedented, so disruptive. And it's why the threat isn't some far-off theoretical thing. It feels immediate. We're not watching, a slow industrial transition play out over decades. We're seeing financial barriers, technical barriers just collapsing almost overnight, it feels like. The sources we're looking at really stress this point. AI is becoming exponentially more efficient, cheaper, and crucially more accessible. This democratization of AI capability, it's shattering the old model where only trillion-dollar tech giants could really play with these advanced systems.
Okay, tell us more about that, the economics of scaling down.
Yeah.
Because I think many people still have this idea that AI is incredibly expensive to run. That seems to be changing fast.
Oh, dramatically so. Just look at the inference cost. That's the cost of actually running the AI model once it's trained, right? The day-to-day operational cost. For a system performing at the level of, say, GPT 3.5, that inference cost plummeted by over 280 times between November 2022 and October 2024.
Right, hang on. 280-fold in just 2 years.
Yes. 280x. Think about what that means. A 280-fold cost reduction. What was maybe a prohibitively expensive API call just a couple of years ago is now, well, practically negligible for many uses. And that just throws the doors wide open for small businesses, medium-sized companies, even solo entrepreneurs to start deploying AI tools that were, until very recently, exclusive to the big tech players.
That's a massive shift. It moves AI from being this kind of strategic, high-cost project to almost a common utility.
Yeah.
The 280x reduction doesn't just trim budgets. It fundamentally changes the competitive landscape for pretty much every industry everywhere.
Precisely. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's being reinforced by core improvements in the underlying technology. We're seeing hardware cost the chips, the servers dropping by about 30% annually. At the same time, energy efficiency, how much power you need for the computation, that's improving by around 40% each year.
Right.
So these efficiency gains stack up, rapidly lowering the financial hurdles, the infrastructure barriers. Deploying advanced AI stops being an optional extra and starts becoming an irresistible economic move for any company that wants to stay competitive.
Okay, and it's not just the cost, right? You mentioned accessibility. What about the models themselves? Are the powerful ones still locked away?
That's the other key piece. We're seeing the gap close really quickly between the proprietary closed models like the early GPTs and the open weight models that anyone can download and use. On some important benchmarks, that performance difference shrank to just 1.7% in a single year.
Only 1.7%. So the really high-end capabilities are spreading out much faster.
Much faster. They're being democratized rapidly, which of course just accelerates the deployment and potentially the displacement risks across more sectors, more jobs.
I have to say the data points on performance leaps in actual white-collar tasks were, well, they were alarming.
Yeah.
We're talking about skills that people felt were high value, very safe, maybe just a year or two ago.
Yes, the speed at which AI is mastering complex cognitive tasks it really is shocking. Let's take the SWE bench coding benchmark. This isn't just asking AI to write a simple hello world script. It's a tough evaluation, testing its ability to solve complex, real-world software engineering problems, bugs, features, the tricky stuff. In 2023, AI systems could correctly solve only about 4.4% of those problems. Basically a novelty.
Okay, 4.4%.
Just 1 year later, 2024, that figure jumped to 71.7%.
Whoa, hold on. From 4% to over 70% in 12 months on complex coding.
71.7%.
That's not just writing boilerplate code anymore. That implies it can handle complex debugging, maybe even just architectural changes, solve problems that you normally need an experienced human developer for.
It absolutely signals a potential shift, moving beyond just helping engineers augmentation towards potentially replacing large chunks of routine engineering work substitution. And this isn't just theory. The sources point out that AI agents are already matching human expert performance on certain highly technical tasks. Like writing Triton kernels, these are super optimized bits of code for running things fast on GPUs. The AI can generate these kernels faster and cheaper than the highly specialized human experts who used to do this.
And all this increasing power is coming in smaller packages too, right? That was another statistic that really jumped out at me. It feels counterintuitive.
It's a bit of a paradox, yeah. The models are getting much, much smarter, but they're also shrinking dramatically in size. Take the MMLU language benchmark. Think of MMLU as like a really broad, tough, general knowledge test for AI. Covers everything from humanities to STEM. It's like an AI PhD exam. Now, look at the smallest model size needed to get a decent score, say surpass 60% on MMLU. That minimum size dropped by an incredible 142-fold.
142 times smaller.
Yes. In 2022, the smallest model hitting that mark was Google's PaLM, a monster model, 540 billion parameters. Needed huge, expensive cloud infrastructure to run. By 2024, Microsoft's Phi 3 Mini achieved the same level of performance with only 3.8 billion parameters.
Okay, let that sink in for a moment for you, the listener. 142 times smaller. That means the economic threat isn't just limited to big companies anymore, the ones who can afford massive cloud computing bills from Google or OpenAI. It means you could potentially run a model with comprehensive PhD-level knowledge better than early GPT-3 on a standard laptop, maybe even a high-end smartphone eventually. It bypasses the whole expensive server infrastructure, and that accelerates the deployment risk down to the individual level, down to small firms globally.
Exactly. The capability is escaping the fortress of the big labs and getting into the hands of, well, potentially anyone with decent computing power. And this unprecedented pace, this accessibility, it forces us to stop thinking about AI as just another tool and start really examining the fundamental economic shift it's driving.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. This breakneck progress, it basically forces us to ditch that old, comfortable assumption that technology is always inherently complementary to human labor. Historically, yeah, we talked about augmentation. The power drill helps the construction worker build faster. The spreadsheet helps the accountant calculate faster. But new research really digging into the U.S. labor market data from 2015 to 2022 highlights this critical need now to distinguish between two types of AI exposure. It's based on this thing called the task-based framework. What the researchers did, which is quite clever, is they mapped AI-related questions from places like Stack Overflow, real-world problems people were trying to solve with AI, directly onto official job descriptions in the WOTNet database. This allowed them to actually measure, for different jobs, how much of the work involves tasks that AI could automate versus tasks where AI could augment.
And making that distinction operational, turning the theory into measurable data, that's brilliant, because it finally lets us move past just speculating about the effects. So, automation AI, that's defined as the tech suitable for doing the entire task. It leads directly to what they call a displacement effect. Jobs potentially disappear. Augmentation AI, on the other hand, is the tech that complements what the worker does. It might boost their productivity, maybe even help create new, more specialized tasks within their role.
Right. And when they isolated the effects of just the automation AI exposure, the picture becomes pretty stark, doesn't it?
It does. The data shows quite clearly that exposure to automation AI has a measurable negative impact on wages.
Negative on wages. So even if there are productivity gains somewhere, they aren't flowing back to the workers in the form of higher pay, on average.
Exactly. It suggests empirically that the displacement effect companies saving money by needing less labor is now so strong that it's outweighing any potential productivity boosts for the workforce overall. The savings are going elsewhere, not to payroll for those specific roles.
And this hits different groups differently.
Yes, it's visible across the board, but the impact is most comprehensive for low-skilled occupations. These are jobs that mostly involve physical activity, manual dexterity, psychomotor skills. For this group, automation AI exposure hits them on three fronts simultaneously. It negatively impacts the creation of new work opportunities for them, it reduces overall employment levels, and it pushes down their wages. The tech basically just removes the need for the human in those specific tasks.
Okay, but then the story flips when we look at augmentation AI.
hmm
And this seems to be the key mechanism driving that wage inequality we keep hearing about.
It looks very much like a classic winner-take-all or winner-take-most dynamic playing out.
Precisely. Exposure to augmentation AI, the helpful complementary tech, does foster the emergence of new kinds of work, and it does increase wages. But here's the crucial part. It only does this for high-skilled occupations. And the absolute kicker in the research, even for this high-skilled group, augmentation AI exposure does not seem to affect the overall employment numbers.
Hold on, let's unpack that because it's critical. So the AI makes the existing high-skilled workers more productive. They get paid more. Maybe they even get new, more specialized job titles.
Exactly. The sources mention new job titles literally appearing in the official ONET database, reflecting these shifts. Things like sprinkler design engineer or remote pilot.
Right. Let's take that sprinkler example. Before AI, designing a complex industrial sprinkler system probably involved tons of tedious calculations, checking regulations, right? Cognitive grunt work. Now, maybe AI handles all that instantly so that human sprinkler design engineer isn't valued for calculating speed anymore. They're valued for interpreting the AI's output, handling unique site challenges, integrating maybe new autonomous fire suppression systems, optimizing the whole thing, tasks needing judgment, not just computation.
That's the augmentation loop, perfectly illustrated. It raises the productivity and the wage of the person already doing the job. But the company doesn't necessarily need to hire more engineers because the existing ones are now superpowered.
And the remote pilot title suggests the same thing, right? AI or autonomous systems might be doing the actual flying, but you still need highly skilled humans overseeing these complex systems, managing exceptions, handling liability.
So the total number of high-skilled jobs isn't necessarily growing, even if the tasks and wages are changing for those within that group.
That's what the data suggests. The pool of high-skilled labor isn't expanding in line with the productivity gains. The market seems to be concentrating value at the top. The high-skilled who can leverage augmentation benefit hugely. They absorb these new specialized tasks, command higher wages, but the total demand for high-skilled workers overall might be static or even slowing down relative to the supply.
And if the supply of highly educated workers keeps growing, as it generally does, but the demand flattens out, well, that spells trouble down the line, even for the high end. You get structural displacement eventually.
Which leads us directly into this idea of the white-collar shock. We've established the mechanism. AI is now capable of substituting, not just augmenting, even in complex, high-skilled work. And unlike historical automation waves that hit manufacturing, agriculture, manual trades hardest, this modern AI shockwave is aimed squarely at cognitive-heavy sectors.
The data really backs that up, doesn't it? Where's the exposure highest?
Overwhelmingly white-collar cognitive roles. The occupations showing the highest levels of AI automation exposure back in 2022 were concentrated in management, business, legal, and STEM fields. And we're talking specific examples like real estate brokers who rely heavily on pulling together information fast, analyzing markets. AI can do that incredibly well now. Or proofreaders and copy markers, a task that large language models can often perform almost perfectly. Even roles like foreign language and literature teachers post-secondary. Think about basic translation, initial composition help. Grammar checking Gen AI handles a lot of that baseline work now. These are all tasks that rely heavily on cognitive abilities, sensory perception, things we thought were uniquely human and safe.
These aren't low-value administrative tasks either. Many require degrees, specialized training. It really challenges that whole promise of the knowledge economy that getting more education guarantees you a secure, well-paid job.
Absolutely. And this leads to a kind of productivity paradox, or maybe a productivity friction point that you really need to focus on. Sectors with higher AI exposure, think financial services, professional services like consulting, law, information and communication, they are seeing massive productivity growth. Their labor productivity growth is almost 5 times greater, 4.8x, compared to less exposed sectors. We're talking an average growth of 4.3% per year between 2018 and 2022 versus just 0.9% in the less AI-exposed parts of the economy.
Okay, on the surface, 4.3% productivity growth sounds amazing for the economy, right? Huge leaps in output should mean more wealth, more prosperity, and eventually that should create more jobs. That's the classic economic story we're told. So where's the disconnect?
That is the million-dollar or maybe trillion-dollar question. Because despite these incredible leaps in output, inefficiency, and profit within these AI-exposed sectors, job openings in those very same occupations, think customer service, IT support, data analysis roles, highly exposed to AI. Yes, they are still growing, but they're growing 27% more slowly on average than jobs in other less exposed sectors.
27% slower growth. So the productivity gains are being achieved through labor substitution, not labor expansion.
It certainly looks that way. Fewer human workers are needed to generate that massive increase in output. It's what economists technically call labor-saving technological change. The technology saves on the cost of labor.
And if the companies generating all this new value need fewer and fewer workers, even while making record profits, then the whole mechanism for distributing that wealth through wages starts to break down, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And when researchers look specifically at generative AI deployment, particularly in Europe, the evidence points very strongly towards substitution. The few empirical studies we have so far indicate that Gen AI specifically seems much more substitutive than complementary in its effects. One major study estimated that large language models could significantly impact at least 10% of the job responsibilities for a staggering 80% of the entire U.S. workforce.
80% of the workforce having at least 10% of their tasks impacted? That's not a niche issue, that's systemic.
It's systemic, and if you roughly translate that level of exposure to the European Union's workforce, the potential short-term displacement number becomes terrifying. Assuming a similar percentage of EU workers are affected, meaning a significant chunk of their job is now easily automatable by Gen AI, you're looking at around 20 million individuals facing a credible threat of being replaced by AI in the short run.
20 million workers in the short run.
Yes, and because these are often those creative, cognitive, high-skill jobs we thought were safe, the ones people invested heavily in education for, displacing them on that scale poses a massive risk of social instability, maybe even widespread social unrest, not to mention a potential economic depression if consumer spending collapses.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Let's try to tie these threads together. We've got Gen AI achieving near-expert human performance in complex thinking tasks. Costs are plummeting. Access is widening. This seems to be fundamentally shifting the economic model from tech helping workers, augmentation, to tech replacing workers, substitution, at least in many areas. This drives huge productivity gains, yes, but they seem concentrated among companies and maybe a small elite of augmented high-skilled workers.
Meanwhile, the broader high-skilled white-collar workforce, the bedrock of the middle class, faces a significant, potentially massive displacement risk. You mentioned 20 million workers potentially affected in the EU alone, short term. So traditional solutions like, oh, just tell everyone to reskill for the next hot job, that starts to look inadequate if the total number of those high-value jobs isn't actually growing, and if augmentation just makes the existing wage gaps even wider. We seem to have a fundamental problem with wealth distribution brewing.
That's exactly right. A distribution problem and potentially a consumption problem, too, which is precisely why the whole conversation around universal basic income, or UBI, is getting a serious rethink. It's moving out of the realm of just, poverty alleviation and into the territory of strategic policy for managing this huge technological transition. We're seeing UBI proposed now in serious policy discussions as an optimal, tax-funded collective risk-sharing measure. What's the goal there?
The core idea, framed this way, is to allow society to deploy AI rapidly because you want those productivity gains for competitiveness and solving big problems, but to do it without causing catastrophic social upheaval and backlash from millions of displaced workers. It's like social insurance against technological disruption.
UBI as insurance, not just a handout. That framing feels important.
It is, and the primary economic argument behind it stems from this very real, uncomfortable possibility that the marginal product of median human labor, what the average person can produce relative to a machine, might soon fall below what's needed for a living wage. If AI can perform many cognitive tasks faster, cheaper, and maybe even better than a human, why would a purely rational company pay a human a living wage to do those tasks?
And if that happens on a large scale, you suddenly have millions of people who can't afford to buy the goods and services that this super productive AI economy is churning out. Demand collapses.
Precisely. So from this perspective, UBI becomes almost necessary just to sustain aggregate consumer spending, to keep the economic engine from seizing up on the demand side. Beyond just consumption, the argument is that it also strategically supports lifelong learning and builds social resilience. It provides that essential financial floor people need during periods of rapid change when they might need to retrain, retool, or transition between jobs or careers, which could become much more common.
You can't really expect someone to spend, say, 2 years learning a completely new skill if they're worried about paying rent next month.
Exactly. UBI could provide that breathing room.
There's also another angle emerging, linking UBI directly to the source of AI's value, the data worker compensation argument. Tell us about that.
Right. This is a fascinating and I think increasingly powerful argument. The entire AI-driven economy runs on data. Massive, unimaginable amounts of it. And where does that data come from? It comes from us, from citizens. Through our everyday online activities, our purchases, our social media posts, the content we create, the feedback we give AI systems, often given freely without direct compensation.
Yeah.
The global market for this data is already valued at over $3 trillion.
$3 trillion, generated essentially by the passive or active contributions of billions of people.
Yes. And in the age of generative AI, which learns directly from human language, creativity, and knowledge expressed in data, you can make a strong case that every citizen is, in effect, an AI worker, or maybe a data proletarian. We're all providing the indispensable raw material, the labeled examples, the text, the images, the interaction data that the digital industry and the autonomous systems need to function, learn, and improve.
So the logic follows that UBI shouldn't just be funded by general taxes, but could be financed directly from the enormous profits being generated by AI, as a form of compensation or a dividend for that data contribution.
That's the essence of the argument. It frames UBI not as welfare, but as a rightful share in the value created by collective data input.
Okay, the rationale is compelling, especially in this new context. But implementing something on the scale of a national, let alone global UBI, that's obviously incredibly challenging. What are the big hurdles? Financing clearly is one. And the other big one is always work incentives, right?
Absolutely. The fear that giving people unconditional money will simply make them stop working. That's probably the single biggest political obstacle UBI faces. And we see this debate flared up constantly, even with existing, more limited social benefit programs. Look at Germany, for instance. The sources mention the ongoing, very polarized debate around their Bürgergeld, the citizen's income. Critics there argue that relatively generous social benefits weaken people's drive to find jobs, potentially creating long-term dependency on the state. It's a fierce political battleground.
And we've actually seen programs that looked a bit like UBI get canceled specifically because of these kinds of criticisms, haven't we?
Yeah.
Italy's experience comes to mind.
That's a major cautionary tale, yes. Italy's reddito di cittadinanza, the citizen's income. It ran for about 4 years, cost the government nearly $29 billion, supported over 1 million families. But it was scrapped in 2023. Why? Largely because critics successfully argued it was disincentivizing work, especially formal employment. There were claims it might even be encouraging participation in the black market economy, with people working undeclared jobs while still collecting the benefit.
So the political judgment was that the negative impacts on work ethic and the budget pressure outweighed the social safety net benefits.
That was the political outcome, yes. It highlights how potent the work incentive argument is.
However,
Yeah.
we do have some proper experimental evidence that suggests the reality of UBI's impact on work might be more nuanced than those political debates suggest. The Finland experiment is key here, right?
It's crucial evidence, yes. Finland ran a proper randomized controlled trial for 2 years, 2017 to 2018. They gave €560 a month to 2,000 unemployed citizens. And the really important part of the design was that the payment was totally unconditional. You got it whether you found a job or not, whether you earned other income or not.
So it removed that classic welfare trap where taking a low-paid job might mean you lose more in benefits than you gain in wages.
Exactly. It tested pure UBI principles.
And what happened? Did they all just sit at home?
Well, the initial headline finding was that, in terms of employment rates, the UBI group didn't perform significantly better than the control group who received standard unemployment benefits. So it didn't magically solve unemployment.
Okay.
But when they dug deeper into other outcomes, the results were striking. The UBI recipients reported significantly better mental health, less stress, higher levels of trust in other people and in institutions, and more confidence in their own futures. They were also slightly more likely to engage in activities like training or starting small businesses.
So maybe it didn't drastically change employment numbers in that short time frame, but it significantly improved well-being, security, and maybe capacity for future engagement.
That's what the deeper analysis suggests. It seemed to function effectively as that risk-sharing mechanism, improving people's resilience and sense of security, which might be incredibly important during a period of rapid technological disruption, even if it doesn't immediately push everyone into jobs that might not exist.
Okay, that improved well-being aspect is really interesting, but it still leaves the massive question: how do you pay for something like this? Especially if automation is potentially shrinking the traditional tax base, income tax, from labor. This seems to require some really fundamental thinking about tax structure.
It absolutely requires radical thinking, not just tinkering around the edges. The sources we looked at explore several bold alternatives for financing UBI. The first, and maybe the most intuitive link, is to tax the source of the disruption itself. Tax the massive profits being generated by AI. Directly link the funding for the social solution to the technology creating the social challenge.
Makes sense conceptually. What else? There was talk about wealth taxes.
Yes, targeting the extreme concentration of wealth, which AI gains are likely to exacerbate. One comprehensive report modeled a global minimum 2% annual wealth tax, just levied on the world's roughly 2,700 or so billionaires, their estimate. That alone could raise something like 236 billion globally each year.
236 billion euros, just from a 2% tax on billionaires. That certainly puts the scale of potential funding into perspective.
It gives you a sense of the vast financial resources concentrated at the very top that could theoretically be tapped for redistribution or funding collective programs like UBI.
But perhaps the most radical proposal mentioned involved not just targeting specific things like AI profits or wealth, but a complete overhaul of the entire income tax system. A German model was cited.
That's right. This was a proposal suggesting financing a national UBI primarily through a simple, uniform 50% tax rate applied to all income, whether it comes from labor or from capital investment.
50%. Flat tax. That sounds incredibly high and potentially regressive.
On the surface, yes. But the key is that this high flat tax would be combined with the UBI payment itself and supplemented by standard consumption taxes like VAT and maybe a carbon tax. The UBI payment acts like a large zero tax bracket. So for lower income earners, the UBI they receive would largely or entirely offset the 50% tax paid on their earnings.
Okay, so the net effect is highly progressive, even with a high flat rate.
Exactly. The study accompanying this model concluded that this specific structure would actually provide substantial net financial relief for the bottom 70% to 80% of income earners. It would shift the overall tax burden significantly upwards towards higher earners and capital income, but through a surprisingly simple mechanism.
So it demonstrates that, structurally, financing UBI is possible if governments are willing to make really bold systemic changes to taxation, moving away from decades of complex incremental adjustments.
It suggests the financing challenge, while huge, might be more a matter of political will and structural redesign than absolute economic impossibility. But it requires abandoning a lot of established tax policy norms.
Right. Okay, so let's try to synthesize all this. We've unpacked quite a lot today. We've seen generative AI reaching near expert levels in complex cognitive work, doing it faster, cheaper, and in smaller packages all the time. This seems to be driving a fundamental shift, moving technology from mainly helping workers to increasingly substituting for them, especially in high-skilled white-collar roles. This creates enormous productivity gains, but those gains seem concentrated, while the displacement risk is broad, potentially hitting millions. You cited 20 million in Europe short-term, creating a massive potential problem for the middle class and overall economic stability.
And that crisis is fundamentally about distribution, isn't it? How do you distribute the wealth generated by AI? And how do you maintain consumption if the value of median human labor falls below a living wage? This shift from AI primarily as a complement to AI potentially as a substitute on a vast scale, it really forces us back to first principles, back to fundamental questions about how we organize society. We really have to confront this deep philosophical issue. If technology creates unprecedented wealth and productivity, but concentrates it among fewer and fewer firms and individuals, how do we ensure fairness? How do we establish what the political philosopher John Rawls famously called the original position?
Right, the veil of ignorance idea. For listeners maybe not familiar, Rawls argued that you design the fairest rules for society by imagining you don't know what your own position in that society will be. You don't know if you'll be born rich or poor, talented or average, lucky or unlucky. Behind this veil of ignorance, what rules would rational people agree on to ensure fairness and protect everyone, especially the least well-off?
And applying that here, if you didn't know whether you'd end up being one of the highly paid, AI-augmented consultants or one of the millions whose cognitive job just got automated away, how would you design the collective risk-sharing mechanism? What level of social insurance, like UBI, would seem fair and rational?
That really crystallizes the challenge for the 21st century, doesn't it?
It does. So, the final question we want to leave you, the listener, with is this. Given everything we've discussed, the speed, the substitution risk, the data contribution argument, should society start viewing its citizens' data and maybe even their general cognitive capacity as a new form of fundamental labor? Labor that deserves direct financial compensation, perhaps through a UBI or a similar risk-sharing dividend funded by AI's productivity?
What did I-
Or will we try to muddle through with the traditional toolkit?